So welcome back. Our next panel is called Faithful or Fearful. Our next panel is called Faithful or Fearful, and it will be moderated by Pastor Todd Callahan. He's a local celebrity. Pastor Todd Callahan of Ignite Church in Williston. Ignite is a thriving church of people who love God and fight for the freedom of our country and religious liberty. He is a graduate of Southeastern University in Lakeland, Florida, with a bachelor's in theology and a master's in leadership. He's been in full-time ministry for 20 years. He previously served as a senior pastor in Orlando, Florida. Pastor Todd is 23 years married and has 4 children and 2 grandchildren. Pastor Todd and the Ignite Church congregation stood with fervent prayer, spiritual passion, and a desire to fight for our foundational freedom, religious freedom, and the freedom to worship during the restrictions of the pandemic. Thank you for your courage and your faithfulness. Please help me welcome Pastor Todd Callahan.
Wow, what an incredible morning so far. Incredible morning. You know, in 2020 and 2021, executive orders for closures were not being applied equally upon secular businesses and other institutions. When arbitrary limits are applied to a church and not to a library or a post office or a grocery store, a liquor store, home improvement stores, or, especially in Vermont, marijuana stores, there was not equal application. These autocratic orders attempted to justify unequal application based on the definition of essential services and attribute it to the greater good. Well, let me ask you a question this morning. By what authority does the government declare the church non-essential? By what authority did the government get to determine how many people could attend or on what basis we could hold services? I'm proud to be able to stand before you as one of several who stood against the totalitarian government of overreach and stood for religious freedom in Vermont and lock arms with people of faith throughout the region. We pushed back on the governor, on the health commissioner, and also the attorney general. We kept our church open because we will not forsake the assembling of the saints together. Amen? The church and places of worship are places where people turn for help and comfort in a climate of fear and uncertainty. In a time of crisis, people are fearful and in need of comfort and community more than ever before. Even people who did not attend church regularly or perhaps never had gone to church need to know that there is somewhere for them to go when they are in need. Many churches not only meet the spiritual needs of the people, but also physical ones, providing food, clothing, and supplies to those in need. Since Roman persecution of the church ended, the church has been viewed by Western civilizations as an essential part of society, a refuge in time of trouble or need, a place of peace and a sanctuary for the weary, even a place of healing and provision. When those can assign a label of non-essential to the practice of religion, then government is taking a very serious and dangerous role of defining religion, which is exceptionally forbidden in our Bill of Rights and in a majority of our state constitutions, and ought to be seen as a violation of the principle that Jefferson spoke of through the separation of church and state. They wrote a letter to Jefferson urging that the same mistakes of the past not be made, that no man ought to suffer in name, person, or effects on account of his religious opinions, that the legitimate power of civil government extends no further than to punish the man who works ill to his neighbor. Jefferson wrote in response, believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, that he owes account to none other for his faith or his worship, that the legitimate powers of government reach actions only and not opinions, I contemplate with sovereign reverence that the act of the whole American people, which declared that their legislature should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state. Thomas Jefferson's famous letter to the Danbury Baptists was ensuring them that America would never return to a time where the government sought to dictate the life of people of faith and the church as a whole. In 2021, when I invited my good friend Charlie Kirk from Turning Point USA to speak at our church, we began seeing a pivotal tipping point taking place in churches around the nation. A great divide having taken place for many. Mask or no mask. Vaccine or no vaccine. And we began to see in houses of worship people be divided through political injections, through the news media, through the school systems. But for others, there was a new awakening and a need for faith. Many people for new faith. Many people coming back to church after 20, 30 years for the very first time. Recent studies have proved over the last 2 years a dramatic increase in anxiety, depression, fear, and a concern about the decades to come. Churches and synagogues closed. Many closed voluntarily without pushing back against the unconstitutional mandates by leaders around the nation. Suicide rates increased, and a separation from family and friends and coworkers initiated. We began to see many people experience emotional, mental, and spiritual pressure for the very first time. As I've looked at drugs such as remdesivir and the amount of people who died and experienced ill effects from taking this drug, how do we in faith circles today begin to trust the science when many are now living in fear when we saw these kinds of experiences take place? Is there a connection with what we have experienced the past 2 years? How did faith leaders do in their response, and how are faith leaders responding now in their roles to see people saved and set free from this bondage of fear? Once our panelists have spoken to you this morning, time willing, we will make time for some engaging questions to help further cultivate this conversation. But now I would like to introduce Dr. Martin Kulldorff, professor of medicine at Harvard University, an epidemiologist and biostatistician, a senior scholar at the Brownstone Institute, and a founding fellow of the Academy of Science and Freedom at Hillsdale College. A world-renowned developer of new sequential statistical methods, his research focuses on infectious disease outbreaks and the monitoring of vaccine and drug safety. Would you warmly welcome Dr. Martin Kulldorff?
Thank you so much, and it's an enormous pleasure to be here and to be speaking to all of you. I'm going to start off by introducing a dear friend and colleague of mine, Dr. Jay Bhattacharya. He sends his regret that he cannot be here in person, but we're going to watch, he's prepared a video for us to watch. Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, he's a professor of medicine at Stanford University. He's an MD and also a PhD in economics. His expertise is in health economics, infectious diseases. And during the pandemic, he has been one of the most outspoken scientists, public health scientists, promoting sanity in public health instead of the insanity that we've gone through during the last 2 years. He is also a very devout Christian, a true man of faith, and I have spoken to him almost on a daily basis during the last 2 years, and we often, we talk mostly about public health, but we often also diverge into issues of Christianity and faith in our discussions. Please welcome Dr. Jay Bhattacharya.
Thank you for the invitation to speak, everybody. My name is Professor Jay Bhattacharya. I'm a professor in the medical school at Stanford University, and I'm the author of the Great Barrington Declaration. I want to tell you today the story of the Great Barrington Declaration, and in particular about how the government responded to the Great Barrington Declaration as a way to create an illusion of consensus in favor of lockdowns that never really existed. I think this has been a broader pattern within the government response to the pandemic of silencing dissenting voices. I want to tell you a little bit about that. And then I'll end with some ideas I have for reform of the government so that these kinds of suppression strategies do not become entrenched as a way of dealing with scientific dissent on a whole variety of other questions that may come up in future. Okay, so let me talk about the Great Barrington Declaration. So the idea of the Great Barrington Declaration, which I wrote with Sunetra Gupta of Oxford University, a fantastic epidemiologist, I think she's one of the best in the world. and Martin Kulldorff, a biostatistician and epidemiologist at Harvard University, again, one of the very best in the world, in October 2020, was this idea that that you could have a very different non-lockdown focused strategy for dealing with the pandemic. Instead of having a blanket lockdown, which really only maybe 20% of the population could abide, the high income laptop class, people who didn't lose their jobs if they could replace their jobs with work from home. Instead, what you have is a strategy that understands the epidemiology of the epidemic. And in particular, the fact that there's an enormous age stratified risk, where there's a 1,000-fold difference in the risk of severe disease if someone who's older gets infected versus someone who's younger. 80% of the deaths from COVID have been in people over the age 65 and above, whereas vanishingly few as a proportion of children have died from the pandemic, from COVID, thank God. On the other hand, the lockdowns themselves that we used to suppress the spread of the disease, this is all throughout 2020, and then also into 2021 in different forms. Those lockdowns had caused tremendous harm to basically everybody, psychological and physical harms, medical harms. We closed schools, which will, in the long run, lead to children being less well educated. We're already seeing that, and that has knock-on consequences for their health throughout their life. There's a lot of evidence from before the pandemic that children that miss even short periods of school in growing up lead shorter, less healthy, poorer lives, and I'm afraid that's what we have done to our children. For young people, we interrupted their careers, their jobs, especially people outside the laptop class. And that, again, has negative consequences that last a very long time, negative health consequences. We interrupted standard screening things like screening recommendations. So, for instance, there'll be many women who will show up with late-stage breast cancer that should have been picked up in 2020 because they skipped their standard screening exams. Same thing with men with respect to prostate cancer, and as well on both men and women for colon cancer. We're likely to see a long tail of physical medical harms from these sorts of basic screening activities being stopped. Children around the world essentially skipped very large, they're very, very important vaccinations like polio, MMR, DPT. These standard vaccination campaigns essentially halted in much of the world in 2020, and we're seeing a resurgence of the polio polio epidemic, which actually we made significant progress toward eradicating. The psychological harms were tremendous. 1 in 4 young adults in June of 2020, according to the CDC survey, seriously considered suicide in the United States. That level of suicidality indicated a level of psychological distress that was just mind-blowing. And that has continued through the pandemic. The rise in the number of people who are on overdosing on fentanyl, on other illegal drugs, that is directly correlated with the psychological harms and stress from lockdowns. And of course, there's the economic harms themselves, such as when you spend trillions of dollars on sort of lockdown during the lockdown that we had to borrow to finance or print money to finance. Of course, the inflation that we're seeing today is also closely connected to the lockdown. Anyway, so if you take these two facts I mentioned, the first, the age stratification of risk, so that the oldest people have a very high risk of dying, 4 or 5% if they should get COVID, and young people have low risk. And you take the other fact, which is that the lockdowns are bad for the mental and physical health of nearly everybody. The logical thing to do is focus protection on the older population. Protect them as best you can during the pandemic from exposure, if it's possible, while consistent with their wants and desires and needs. So, at the same time, for the younger population, lockdowns are an unethical imposition on their lives that harm them physically and do not actually serve to protect the old. So the Great Barrington Declaration recommended focused protection for the old and lifting the lockdown restrictions on the lives of the young, especially opening schools so that kids could have something near approaching normal life. Not that normal life would be entirely there. There's still the risk of the disease floating around. People would take voluntary measures to try to protect older people in their families. Public health could take measures to provide resources to older people so that they could protect them, get protected as best they could. Organize campaigns to deliver food, for instance. And when the vaccines came, prioritize vaccinating older people because the vaccines are very good at protecting against severe disease. Of course, it's older people that face the highest risk of severe disease. But the lockdowns needed to go. We wrote the Great Barrington Declaration on October 4th, 2020. 4 days later, the head of the National Institute of Health in the United States, a man named Francis Collins, a very famous scientist, wrote an email to Tony Fauci, the head of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease, NIAID, in 4 days after we wrote the Great Barrington Declaration. In those 4 days, the proposal, which we put online, had gone viral. Tens of thousands of scientists had signed on, including Nobel Prize winners, including very prominent epidemiologists, very prominent medical doctors had signed on. And of course, hundreds of thousands of regular people signed on. It resonated as a common sense approach. And frankly, it's an approach that we have used over the last 100 years to address respiratory pandemic after respiratory pandemic. It's a lockdown strategy, which is really out of line with that history. So 4 days after we wrote it, Francis Collins wrote an email to Tony Fauci, which I discovered several months later from a FOIA request that an outside group had done, that said that called me, Sunetra Gupta, and Martin Kulldorff, the three of us, fringe epidemiologists. The email then directed Tony Fauci, from the head of the National Institute of Health, to organize to identify and organize a devastating takedown of the premises of the Great Barrington Declaration. Tony Fauci then later responded with an email to a Wired magazine article by an author who just didn't like the Great Barrington Declaration, but in particular characterized us as wanting to let the virus rip through society. When in fact, what we were calling for was a strategy of focused protection of the vulnerable, the old. We were not calling for letting the virus rip. He called it a herd immunity strategy, which is a nonsensical term, since the endpoint of any epidemic like this is herd immunity. It's herd immunity in this case means a large fraction of the population is infected and recovers. That's just the endpoint of this pandemic. And when because they have recovered from COVID, they have protection against subsequent infection and subsequent severe disease on infection. So that you will see the virus circulate basically forever, but the close coupling of cases and deaths that we saw early in the pandemic would be decoupled, so that the cases will spread, but each case would produce many fewer deaths per case, which is exactly what we've seen through the course of the pandemic. Anyway, see, the article demonized the herd immunity strategy, essentially accusing us of wanting to harm the population. This was the tenor of all of the media requests I received in the months after the Great Barrington Declaration. When I would get calls from hostile reporters asking me why I want to let the virus rip, which again, the Great Barrington Declaration doesn't propose, didn't say in any way or endorse, why we wanted to essentially create enormous damage to the population. This was essentially a propaganda campaign that the media participated in at the behest of the head of the National Institute of Health. I kept hearing the words "let it rip." Tony Fauci said those words about me, about the Great Barrington Declaration. It was very clearly a coordinated media campaign to dismiss the idea, and the idea that we were fringe epidemiologists. Well, that was at sort of the core of this media campaign. Essentially, the media repeated the propaganda that the government had decided that against the Great Barrington Declaration. Why did it do this? Well, the reason is very simple. The lockdowns were an absolutely extraordinary measure. They've not ever been tried in history as a response to a respiratory pandemic at the scale that we tried it. And the restrictions were tremendously controversial. People lost their businesses. People lost their careers. People lost their livelihoods. Huge numbers of people were harmed by these lockdowns. In order to justify it, the government needed to make sure that people understood that there was a consensus of scientists in favor of lockdown. that this was not just a minor position, but a consensus position, that there were only very, very few fringe people who were opposed to it. What the Great Barrington Declaration did was that it blew up that lie. In fact, there were tens of thousands of scientists who disagreed with the government position that lockdowns was the only way to address the pandemic. And in fact, that many scientists, many epidemiologists, many doctors thought that the lockdowns were more harmful than the good they were accomplishing. In fact, that's turned out to be true. There have been now a number of studies that have been done. A survey by this group at Johns Hopkins University in a meta-analysis found that lockdowns saved very few, if any, lives from COVID. And of course, separately, the lockdowns caused tremendous collateral harm, as I've described already. So you have a government that uses its power in order to suppress dissent against its own policies. But it gets worse. Francis Collins is head of the National Institute of Health. The National Institute of Health gives out tens of billions of dollars each year to scientists around the country, and in fact, indeed, around the world. The careers of scientists in biomedicine depend on being able to get and win awards from the National Institute of Health. It's not just the money, but also the prestige that comes with winning a National Institute of Health award. I myself have been funded from the NIH for 2 decades. In order to get tenure at top medical universities, you need to win NIH awards. It's a marker of success in the field. The head of the NIH and the head of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease, like Tony Fauci, therefore holds tremendous power over the minds and utterances of scientists. Scientists who disagreed with Tony Fauci during the pandemic did so fearing for their careers, especially prominent scientists. And so what you had was a very powerful set of people at the top of a scientific hierarchy, a government scientific hierarchy, sending a very clear signal that anyone who opposed lockdowns was on the fringe, on the outside. And of course, many scientists silenced themselves during the pandemic because they didn't want the program that came with being on the fringe. Scientists would write to me, even scientists who signed the declaration would tell me about scientists who signed the declaration, tell me that they had faced repercussions in their own lives, in their careers, as a consequence of signing. Some people lost their jobs. Some people had grant opportunities go away, opportunities for collaboration go away. It was an act of courage to sign the declaration by rank-and-file scientists. And the problem was that this is just the tip, right? So most scientists who didn't sign, many of whom agreed with us, actually kept themselves silent. I now believe that it's very likely that a consensus of scientists opposed the lockdowns, even when we wrote the declaration in October. In fact, the appearance, the illusion of consensus was created by this kind of concerted government action to suppress discussion about the lockdowns. Unfortunately, this is not the only topic on which that we saw this exact pattern of behavior by government scientists. This happened also, for instance, on the possibility of the lab leak, whether the origin of the virus was in a set of research activities, gain of function activities to try to predict the spread of a new pandemic from animal hosts. These sort of like, was it a lab leak based on that research activity, or was it a natural occurrence that just unfortunately happened in China, in 2019? In the early days of the pandemic, the possibility that there might have been a lab leak as an origin of the virus was suppressed in very similar ways. Scientists who spoke up and said, well, look, the biology of this virus looks really weird. It doesn't look like something that would come out of natural evolution. Look, the story about the leak, the Wuhan market as the source of the virus doesn't really hold up very well. I mean, maybe it was a super spreader event, but it wasn't really. It was not clear that it was the origin of the virus. A lot of scientists have those questions. I personally don't know for certain whether it's a lab leak or natural origin. But during the early days of the pandemic, what happened was that the NIH, including Tony Fauci and Francis Collins, worked to create the idea in the press that anyone who thought that it might be a lab leak was in fact on the fringe. that it, in fact, it became a conspiracy theory to suggest that it might have been a lab leak, when in fact, it wasn't a conspiracy theory. It was actually a legitimate concern by scientists as a legitimate theory to explain the origins of this virus. So meaning that the NIH has used this strategy more than once. You could say also similar things for people who were arguing for testing new repurposed drugs to treat the disease, early treatment for the disease. A concerted effort to make sure that only people, government scientists who were, or other scientists who were towing the conventional line on aspects of science on which there was legitimate disagreement, were seen as doing correct science, the science, whereas anyone else who disagreed on the outside, despite their credentials, despite any the strength of their arguments, was seen as fringe on the outside. This kind of strategy by government scientists, bureaucrats, is tailor-made to create a situation where science cannot actually function. Science requires dissent. Science requires outside voices to say, look, I'm not sure this is right. Why don't we run this experiment and see? Science requires good faith discussions among people who disagree with each other. And science should never be used to create, to essentially get force a policy consensus that on the basis of a false idea a false idea of consensus that didn't actually exist, which is exactly what happened on various aspects of policy during the COVID pandemic. There was in particular a deep conflict of interest, I think, revealed by the actions of Tony Fauci and Francis Collins. A conflict of interest between that I didn't realize before the pandemic existed, but now is very clear that it does. Scientific funders, when they play such an outsized role in the careers and success of scientists, automatically have a conflict of interest start when they start making pronouncements and they contribute to discussions about health policy or science policy. Those policy discussions need to have a wide range of voices available. When the top scientific bureaucrats weigh in on lockdowns, for instance, they essentially reduce the room that people have to dissent against lockdowns. On any scientific policy that a top scientific funder weighs in on, will automatically reduce the room for dissent by scientists. This is a conflict of interest. It's as deep a conflict of interest as a pharmaceutical company sitting and telling essentially making the FDA, sitting in place of the FDA and saying, yeah, our drug is safe, we, the FDA, approve it, by somebody who's in the pay of the pharmaceutical industry. You essentially cannot have this kind of effectively a financial conflict of interest whereby scientific funders participate in science discussions and thereby put their thumbs on the scale on what the outcome of these scientific discussions are on the science policy. There needs to be as bright a line between the science funders and science policy, so that Tony Fauci, for instance, should not actually ethically participate in the discussions about COVID policy, as there is between pharmaceutical companies and the promotion of drugs by doctors, for instance. That should be seen as a deep conflict of interest that with a bright line, an ethical line that should never be crossed. There are other reforms. So I think that's like the first reform I think I would suggest. Create within government ethics offices this idea that there is this conflict of interest, enforce it as vigorously as you would with pharmaceutical company conflicts of interest. Same thing with discussions in the scientific journals. There should be a disclosure that about these kinds of scientific conflicts of interest. Second, I think that there should be there should be a reform so that doctors essentially should have a bill of rights to be able to speak their minds. Many physicians during the pandemic felt silenced, not just by scientific bodies, but by their medical boards. The medical boards weighed in on basic science policy ideas, right? So, for instance, they interfered with doctors who decided that, for whatever reason, that the vaccine mandates were a bad idea, or the vaccines may not be appropriate for children, or whatever. Rather than allow doctors to have their say over their view of the scientific evidence, and instead, many physician societies, especially outside, especially in Canada, in Australia, but even in the United States, suppressed doctors that had these kinds of dissident ideas. In fact, many doctors lost their license for prescribing relatively safe pharmaceuticals like ivermectin. Even leaving aside whatever thinking you may have about whether it works or not, it certainly is within the purview of doctors, and always has been, to prescribe drugs off-label for uses. It's standard practice in medicine, especially drugs that are relatively safe for purposes that the doctors deem are right for their patients. And instead, doctors faced an environment where they would lose their license, lose their accreditation as a consequence of making decisions they thought would be good for their patients. Third, I think that the CDC itself needs to be thoroughly reformed, and the processes by which the CDC makes decisions needs to be reformed, so that it institutionally has outside voices when it's making policy pronouncements, policy decisions. It's been very clear from looking at the CDC that they came to opinions about science that were outside of the norms. For instance, whether someone who's COVID recovered actually has good protection against reinfection, good protection against severe disease on reinfection. I mean, that evidence was clear from early on, and yet the CDC was very slow to come to that point. On masks, for instance, the CDC had pushed sort of low quality studies, never conducted a really high quality randomized evaluation of masks. In fact, I don't think they conducted a randomized evaluation of masks at all during the whole pandemic. The CDC needs outside scientific advisors intimately involved with decision making, so that the insular decision making sort of groupthink cannot emerge out of CDC decision making, and outside voices play a real important role in scientific discussions within the CDC. The idea would be to maybe have a plan. Sometimes in military circles you'd have the main advisors, and then you'd have a plan B advisors, essentially playing devil's advocate, saying, "Well, is this right?" And you have institutionalize a debate on science policy inside government agencies like the CDC that set pandemic policy. There are a whole host of other ideas that need to happen, but I think more important than any specific idea is the fact that science and the science bureaucracies failed during the pandemic because they did not permit scientific discussion to happen, and in fact actively worked with media, with big tech, and with medical boards to suppress this kind of discussion from happening, to the detriment of all. When the next pandemic hit, and there will be another one, when the next scientific crisis arises, or crisis arises where science can play a role, which is all the time, there needs to be much better processes so these kinds of abuses never happen again, or else the public will suffer just as they have during the pandemic. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention.
I was stunned in the spring of 2020. I've been working on infectious disease outbreaks for 2 decades. And I was absolutely stunned that suddenly we're talking about lockdowns. And we threw the principle of public health out the window, principles that we have followed for at least 100 years. As Jane mentioned, there's an enormous age gradient in the mortality risk from COVID. So I don't know if you were ever afraid of COVID, but I was. I was very afraid for about 10 minutes. When we learned that the virus has spread from Wuhan to there was 2 major outbreaks outside of China. One was in northern Italy, another one was in Iran. At that point, it was absolutely clear to me as an infectious disease epidemiologist that this virus was going to spread worldwide. It will reach every part of the world sooner or later. And most of us will be exposed to it. So that was scary, but what I did then, I looked at the data from, the very earliest data from Wuhan about mortality. And based on that data, I did some simple calculations and finding out that there's a 1,000-fold difference between the mortality risk from the old and the young. And at that time, we didn't know the absolute risk, but we know the relative risk. So it was obvious here that while this was a serious disease for older people, as a parent, I am more concerned about the health and the life of, as any parent is, about my children than about myself. So when I saw this data, I knew that my 3 children, Diego and Finn and Una, who sits back there, that they will be fine. They were going to survive this. So I was no longer afraid. For me, oh, it was a small risk. I figured it's probably about the same risk as me getting diagnosed with cancer in the next 4 or 5 years. And that's something we'll live with. We all know that that could happen. So, okay, that could happen with cancer, it could happen with COVID. I'm not going to be afraid of that. That was my experience of 10 minutes of fear. Jay mentioned the Great Barrington Declaration, and in the middle here in the picture is Dr. Sunata Gupta, who in my view is the preeminent infectious disease immunologist in the world from Oxford University, and where we argued that we should not do lockdowns, we should do focused protection. And of all the things I've done in science, science is about finding novel things, coming up with new ideas, new suggestions. Of all the things I've written in science, this is the least novel thing I've done. There's nothing new in here. It's all based on old principles of public health. Earlier this year, a few of us wrote something we call the 10 ethical principles of public health as a way of combating how public health is being co-opted. And we have 2 of my co-authors of this here. Jay is, of course, one, but we have Aaron and Roger, who was on the previous panel. They are both participate in writing these things. And I was thinking we could go through these 10 principles one by one in a little bit larger font than you see here. So the first one is that public health is about overall health, not a single disease. If you go to your physician and you have diabetes, the physician is concerned about you and your diabetes. That's the way it should be. But public health should never be concerned with only a single disease like COVID. It has to do with everything. So you can't just focus on COVID, you also have to consider collateral damage from public health from whatever measures you put in. And we have seen that we have missed cancer screenings and treatments. So actually cancer went down in 2020. It's not because people didn't get cancer, it's because it wasn't detected and therefore it wasn't treated. And that's bad. Now, that doesn't show up in the mortality statistics immediately, but let's say a woman who would normally have lived 15, 20 years might now die of cervical cancer 3 or 4 years from now. Cardiovascular disease outcomes is worse. Skipped diabetes appointment, plummeting child vaccination rates, deteriorating mental health, malnutrition and starvation in developing countries. The list goes on and on and on. And it's probably the most tragic things I've ever encountered in public health. Also, it's about so this is the thing that about mental health, about 25% of young adults having suicidal ideation that Jay mentioned. This is the data for that. We also have to think about short versus long term. What lockdowns did, it just pushed the problems into the future. Now, there's some point with that because we don't want everybody to get sick at the same time. So, because then the hospitals get overwhelmed. So there's a certain point in the beginning of the pandemic to make sure that especially older people who are at the highest risk for hospitalization, that they take care so we don't all get sick at the same time. But the longer you flatten the curve, the longer the pandemic is, the more harder it is actually to protect older high-risk people. And of course, the more collateral damage there is. So here's an example from Europe. In the spring of 2020, Sweden was heavily criticized as the only major country that didn't lock down. We kept schools open for all kids aged 1 to 15, never closed, etc. Businesses were open and so on. They did take measures as they should in a pandemic, but it wasn't a lockdown like the rest of Europe did in the US. You can see here that in the beginning, Sweden was not having quite a few COVID cases, but then as time goes, other countries catch up, and in the end, Sweden had among the lowest excess mortality in Europe during this pandemic. Also, public health is about everyone. It's not just about a certain person or a certain group of people. And I think in public health, we always have to have special concern about the most vulnerable members of society. That includes children. It includes people, poor people and working class people. It includes older, frailer people. We didn't do that during the pandemic. This is the guy that we protected. Young, low-risk members of the laptop class who could work at home. Maybe they are working as, they may be a lawyer or a banker or a scientist or a journalist. So we protected younger professional people who were low risk and didn't need protection, at the same time as we didn't protect working people, older working people, the cab driver who is 65 who's driving the cab, the 67-year-old person who is sitting at the cashier at the supermarket, or the chef in the Chinese restaurant who is providing take-out food to all these members of the laptop class. This is from Toronto. You can see that in the beginning there was sort of a little bit in everywhere, but then eventually in the wealthier neighborhoods there was less COVID mortality, and the poorer neighborhoods there were more. Here is Los Angeles, similar things. There were higher mortality rates about poor people than the wealthier people. We threw the working class and the poor people under the bus during this pandemic. And not only with COVID, also with lockdowns, because it affected working people more than wealthier people. School closures also. Wealthier people, they could put their schools in private school or hire a tutor. Poorer people, they did not have that option. So it's kind of, in my view, it shows that freedom and liberty is important for everybody, but it's even more important for people at the lower levels of society, the less affluent people. They're the ones who depend on liberty and freedom the most. Public health is both local and global. You have to adapt public health strategy to the specific location. And for example, in the developing countries, many children starve to death because, and also adults, because they closed the market where they live day to day, and they couldn't get income and they couldn't feed themselves. One thing is that risk can be reduced. That's the point of public health, but it can never be eliminated. That's a philosophy that's very dangerous because it causes other things. So this zero COVID, that we should eliminate COVID, that was impossible from the beginning and should never have been attempted. Fear should never be used in public health. We need accurate information about the risks, but we don't go around to be fearful of cancer. We know there's risk for it, and we know we're not supposed to smoke because that increases the risk. We need to have that information. So we need to have that information to lower the risk, but we shouldn't go around and scare people about getting cancer or diabetes or cardiovascular disease. Fear should never be used as a tool in public health. And the message that came out during the pandemic, people had very strange misconceptions about the fear. The yellow here is the proportion of COVID mortality by age. So you can see that it's very, very high in the 65 and up, over 80%. In 24 and under, it's 0.0% of all mortality was in that age group. The orange and the blue are what people thought. So people overestimated the risk for younger people widely, more than 100-fold, but they underestimated them for for the older people. Here is how many do you believe have died from COVID? There was a survey in July of 2020. In the US, the average number that people gave was 9%. People thought that 9% of Americans had already died from COVID. That's more than 200 more than it was true. I guess the British, they were a little bit smarter than the Americans, I'm sorry to say. They thought it was only 7%, and that was 100 times more than the truth. 58% of Americans aged 18 to 24 said they fear significant health consequences if they become infected with the virus. They have almost zero risk of mortality and severe consequences. But they were very, very afraid. Another principle is we should not use coercion in public health. Public health measures should be voluntary, and that has to do with trust. If you force, at least if you try to force me to do something, I tend to go, I don't trust you if you do that. So coercion in public health is bad from a philosophical point of view. It's also bad from a public health point of view. And one example, of course, is the vaccine mandates, which I think there should be no vaccine mandates for COVID vaccines. Honesty and transparency. Public health must be honest about what the truth is. And also, when we don't know something, we have to be honest about that. Otherwise, there will not be trust and confidence. And I think that public health has lost the trust of the population. CDC has lost the trust in the populations, and deservedly so. And I'm not going to say that we should try to restore the trust in public health, because that's sort of what we have to restore the integrity of public health, and then trust will come. Because at this point, we should not restore the trust, because CDC doesn't deserve our trust at this point. Here's just one example about vaccines. This is a study from Israel. It was an important study because it was said that if you had COVID, if you recovered, there was questioned whether you were immune, if you had immunity. That included the current director of CDC, who questioned immunity after having recovered from COVID. But that's something that we have known for 2,500 years, since the Athenian plague in Greece. They knew that once you recovered, that was a serious plague, but once you recovered, you wouldn't get it again. And they used the recovered to care for the sick. So we have known this for 2,500 years, except we forgot it 2 years ago in 2020. And this is an example that compared immunity in the vaccinated versus those who have had COVID, recovered. And those who were vaccinated, they had 13 times higher risk of having a positive test, 27 times higher risk of having symptomatic disease, 8 times higher risk of hospitalization. They looked at death also, but there was 0 death in both groups, so you can't really compare it. So if you combine this information with the earlier one, with the age gradient and risk of 1,000-fold excess, it becomes sort of very clear, I think, what you do with the vaccine. So let's go back to early 2021. Let's say you're in your 70s, you haven't had COVID. Well, there might be some small risk with the vaccine, but your risk from COVID is high because you're in the high-risk group. So it made perfect sense to take the vaccine if you're in that situation. And I think the vaccine saved many lives in this group. Now, let's go to the current time. I think it was last week that CDC's Advisory Committee for Immunization Practices, ACIP, recommended that the COVID vaccine should be part of the childhood vaccine schedule. Now, at least 80% of children in the US have already had COVID. They have natural immunity, which is superior to vaccine immunity. Also, we know from the other figure that they are very, very low risk. So even if they haven't had COVID, their risk is minuscule. So even so as long as there's some risk from the vaccine, then even if it's small, that's going to be higher than the benefits. So it makes absolutely no sense to vaccinate a 5-year-old or a 10-year-old child from COVID. Now, I think right now that's sort of acceptable to say to some extent, but when I said that first time in the early 2021, I was censored by Twitter. Conflict of interest, I think there has been a lot of conflict of interest. I think shouldn't be part of public health. It's also important with all civilized discourse. We can't have science if we can't discuss science, if we get censored or slandered or smeared. Here's a copy of that email that Jay talked about, where the director of NIH, Francis Collin, wrote to Tony. Tony is Dr. Anthony Fauci, calling us fringe technologists, and there need to be a quick and devastating published takedown of the Great Barrington Declaration. The role of NIH is not to do that. The role of NIH is to stimulate scientific discourse. So what a good NIH director would do say is, okay, they may be right or wrong, let's have a discussion between them and Fauci and argue their respective and have it public. That would have been the right approach of the NIH director. The 10th principle and last one is listen to the public. It's the public who is living public health. It's the parents, the mothers and fathers whose children don't go to school. They see the effect on the children of not being able to play soccer or baseball or basketball. It's the families and the old people who the families can't visit them in the nursing home or in the hospitals. They are living the consequences. Old people dying alone. It's the small businesses who have to close. It's the people working in those businesses who get out of work. It's the religious congregations who can't meet, who don't get neither the spiritual or the social support from that. So you have to listen to the public, and I think that is very important for public health, which public health has forgotten about. And I think that was my last slide, so thank you so very much for listening. I appreciate it.
I spoke at least anyway.
Thank you, Dr. Koldorf. Amazing, amazing. We've heard from Rabbi Lamb earlier this morning, so I'm going to introduce him very quickly just by saying go download his podcast, Good Faith Effort, right? Come on. Would you please welcome Rabbi Lamb?
I'm going to stay down here to keep it conversational. I don't have much to add on the public health side of things because I'm not a public health expert myself. I'm a theologian and a rabbi. But what I will say here is that the untouched upon premise of so much of what we've been discussing here, I think, is actually of central interest to us today, and we should be explicit about it, which is we've talked extensively about the backdrop against which all of the issues that we're concerned about here take place. And that backdrop is some combination of anxiety, of antipathy towards religion, of unwillingness to resume what we would have regarded in, on the eve of 2020 as normal life. And I think we've done, understandably, because these issues are important, but we've done insufficient probing of why that is. Why are people so anxious to resume their lives? Why, even after lockdowns were no longer official policies, were people so reticent, even today, to get back to work? I'm from North Jersey, but I'm just over the bridge from Manhattan, and you can walk into supermarkets in Manhattan and you'll see people like triple masking today. So how do we explain this? I mean, it's amongst people who are in their individual lives relatively smart people, seemingly well-adjusted. Why is this a thing? And it occurs to me that the wisdom of Tocqueville is being underappreciated here. Alexis de Tocqueville is probably the greatest observer and chronicler of American life in the 19th century and one of the great commentators upon American virtue. And his core insight, which may be a little bit overstated, but his core insight is that what makes America unique is its associational life. is our willingness and, in fact, our insistence on coming together and forming strong, thick bonds of friendship and community and association amongst each other. And while Tocqueville may have overstated that a little bit, because it turns out that the most important associations and socially net positive associations that Americans formed in the 19th century that have since declined are actually religious institutions, and it turns out that more sports teams or more bowling leagues or whatever doesn't necessarily make us socially healthier, as fun as they may be. I myself love basketball, but it turns out that what we have lost in American life over the course of the last several decades is a strong sense that religion and morality are, as George Washington described them once upon a time, the indispensable supports for American political prosperity. And that, of course, has resulted in all sorts of policy implications, and I think you can find, for example, in Roman Catholic Diocese of Brooklyn versus Cuomo, which Pastor Callahan, I think, alluded to before, where you have disparate treatment of religious organizations during COVID. What this can result in is bad policy making, but I think much more importantly, especially for those of us, which I hope is everybody in this room, who care deeply about all of our fellow Americans, even or especially when we disagree with them, what this has led to is an America in which most Americans have no thick social ties. And what this leads to is a sense during COVID, and I have a strong intuition here, but I wonder if you've all felt this also. For many Americans, the collective loneliness of COVID was the only meaningful act of community in their lives. So for somebody who's been stripped of their religious associations, who's been denuded of their thick communities, whose parents told them that religion is silly and community is nonsense and Rousseau is right and we're all fundamentally good and society and community and tradition and values are actually holding us back, those people have no community in their lives. And so for all of us to engage in this act of solidarity together, where everybody's wearing a mask and we're all, or at least in the minds of people who can do it, we're all, not everybody was, but we're all sitting at home and we're all in this together, that's the most powerful form of community most people have had in their lives. I'll throw out a thought experiment to you. And this is not directed at people in this room for whom I suspect the answer is more similar to my answer, but I ask you to consider Americans who are still triple masking today. Ask a person like that, if your car broke down on the side of the road, and imagine you don't have AAA or you don't have some form of, some pickup truck that will just show up there magically. How many people in your phone could you call who would drop everything, no matter what, and come to the side of the road and pick you up? How many people do you have in your life who would do that? For most Americans, the answer is, if you're lucky, maybe one person. Maybe one person. For most people, it's probably none. Now, I'm deeply fortunate and blessed by God to have grown up in a community where the answer is dozens upon dozens upon dozens of people. I mean, 2/3 of my phone would do it. But I didn't deserve any of this. It's not because I'm such a good guy or I'm so good looking. On the contrary, you can all see me. But it's because I grew up in a community that took community seriously and that took the rich associations that Tocqueville documented as a virtuous part of the American experiment. And so I think at the same time as we are laudably concerned to excavate the scientific underpinnings of whatever policies we're making, and as we are admirably anxious to understand precisely where it is that the public health establishment is and how it can be improved and how it can be made better, as Dr. Koldorf was just describing, I think as people who take faith seriously and who are seeking to, as the title of the summit is, to restore faith in America, I think our primary responsibility is to, first of all, wonder why it is that so many of our fellow Americans don't have the blessings that we have, and then think to ourselves, what can we do to restore American faith? Not just faith in America, but the faith of America. Because at the end of the day, While religious toleration in America is one of the great achievements of this society and truly in world history, it is, at the end of the day, not America that protects religion, but religion that protects America. And so I'll conclude with just a plea for an ethic of compassion in this discussion, which you can already see already, and I'm so gratified by it. But the ethic of compassion would be to wonder why so many. I mean, if you walk into a store in Manhattan where I am and you see someone triple masking, and you see somebody who's just so anxious they don't know how to go. And the question we should ask ourselves is, how do we heal a society that communicates to its citizens that the only way to have a healthy community is to do it in an unhealthy way? That's the plea that I ask for.
Wonderful. Wonderful. We're short on time a little bit, but I want to, if we could set up two people who have questions. If there's two individuals that would like to line up for questions, please do so. And while you do that, 56% of faith leaders' main worries for the church in the United States, their chief concern is reaching a younger audience. However, that younger audience, especially Generation Z, has now been inundated with fear and anxiety. Rabbi Lamb, how are we going to uproot the fear that this culture has injected into this generation?
It's a fantastic question. I actually wrote a piece about this for the Wall Street Journal a couple months ago. One thing that we commonly hear is that Gen Z is lost. And it is true that church attendance has dropped below 50% for the first time in American history as of last year, and that's a cause for concern. But and this is one of the things that we work on at Soul Shop Studios, where we do faith-driven entertainment for Gen Z, is that in fact Gen Z is deeply, deeply curious about religion and faith. 77% describe themselves as seeking spirituality. Unclear exactly what that means, but seeking spirituality. 71% describe themselves as identifying as religious. And while they're not going to brick and mortar houses of worship, that's because Gen Z is not going to brick and mortar anything, whether it's retail stores or theaters or anything else. Right. Where they are active is in spaces where they are in control, or where control is the wrong word, but where they feel like the main people at the party. So TikTok, Snapchat, Instagram, YouTube, these are places where faith actually is flourishing. You look at, I mean, I'm not a Christian, as you can tell from my hat, but if you look at Christian TikTok, it is unbelievable what's happening there. It is incredible. I mean, millions and millions, hundreds of millions of people are actively engaged there. And I think we do ourselves a disservice when we, I mean, as Americans always have done, we are perpetually concerned about the young, and humans are naturally that way. But I think we do ourselves a disservice when we give up on Gen Z, because Gen Z is actually hungrier than they've ever been before. And they're hungry for precisely the reason that I just discussed, which is their parents and their grandparents have told them, just be yourself. That's been the prevailing ethic since at least the 60s, or since at least the 90s, maybe the 60s. Be yourself. Increasingly, what young Americans have learned is that in order to be yourself, you need to do it by yourself. And that's scary, and it's lonely. And what people are looking for is community, tradition, and values. And we need to engage our flock where they are grazing, and that's the way to do it.
Amen. Amen. Awesome. Wonderful. One question here.
I understand what you're saying about community and people wanting to belong. I'm just wondering what your opinion is about some people who may be feeling a disappointment in established religion or established churches and synagogues. I personally am Catholic, and I feel a little disappointment in what the church has done lately. So I don't know if that's a part of why people are kind of stepping back from established religion or, formal religion.
It's a wonderful question. When you consider the origins of America's system of checks and balances, as any of the founding fathers would have told you, as Thomas Paine could have told you, or even prior to the American founding, as John Milton of Paradise Lost fame would have told you, it all proceeds from the Hebrew Bible. So the earliest place you can find the system of checks and balances is in the book of Deuteronomy. You have kings, you have priests, you have the prophet. and they all perform different functions and they check each other. That's the root of the American founding. The root of the American founding is in what our founders would have called the Hebrew Republic. Now, I ask you to consider for a moment what the Bible thinks of a society that perfectly implements this system of government. Well, our kings fail. David is a famous example, but all you need to do is just name check a list of the monarchs of the United Monarchy and eventually the Kingdom of Judah to see just a long list of failures. The priests fail. I mean, you can look at the Book of Kings and you can see failure after priestly failure. Our prophets even fail. God decommissions Elijah and hands over his prophetic mantle to Elisha precisely because Elijah loses his confidence in his people as a prophetic failure. So at the end of the day, all three supports of the biblical system of checks and balances are destined to fail. And the Bible anticipates this. So what's the message? The message is, ultimately, human beings are frail and imperfect, and so everything that we design is going to fail. Ultimately, entropy is a law of the universe. The question is, what role can we play in bringing redemption a little bit closer? And so the truth is, if your particular community or community on the scale, I mean, in Judaism we don't have a sort of an ecumenical church, but if your faith community, if your church system, your church hierarchy, your synagogue, your mosque has failed you, well, those things are destined to happen. God anticipates it because we are who we are. We're free beings who have to choose a relationship with God, and that means sometimes we'll choose wrong. The question is, what role can we play in bringing the system that God envisions for the Hebrew Republic a little bit closer to reality in these United States of America?
Excellent.
I think one key is if people are willing to debate and discuss things with their opponents. I have always been throughout, and so has Jay and others, been willing to debate any of those people who criticize us, because we think we have the truth on our side, at least for the majority. I think the only person that Anthony Fauci has debated is Senator Rand Paul, because he has no other choice, because he has to go in front of the Senate, and Rand Paul is one of the few physicians in the Senate. So somebody who doesn't want to debate, who instead wants to censor and slander and smear, that's, I think, because they don't have the arguments on their side. Another episode was that so Scott Atlas was the COVID advisor in the Trump White House for a few months in 2020, and he was heavily criticized by, in an open letter from Stanford. He's at Stanford, he's a professor there, and he was heavily criticized by 98 other medical Stanford faculty, but they didn't have any substance to the criticism in my view. So I wrote a letter to the Stanford student newspaper defending Scott and also challenging any of those 98 people to debate this issue with me. None of them wanted to do it. And I think it's because they don't really have the arguments on their side.
Wonderful. Can you say thank you to Rabbi Lamb and Dr. Koldorf for an amazing panel? Thank you. God bless you.